Out of every 10 soldiers who strapped a flamethrower to their back in World War II, only one would ever see home again. They had a life expectancy measured in minutes, not months. They were simultaneously the most feared and most targeted soldiers on any battlefield. But their story goes far deeper than just statistics. It's a tale of ordinary men forced to wield hell itself, and the devastating price they paid for it. When people think of World War II weapons, they imagine rifles, tanks, maybe artillery. But there was one weapon that stood apart from all the rest, not because of its range or power, but because of what it did to both the enemy and the man who used it. The flamethrower wasn't new to World War II. It had first appeared in the trenches of World War I, where German engineers developed it to clear bunkers and break through defensive lines. But by the time the Pacific War erupted, American forces would perfect it into something far more deadly and far more personal. The evolution from World War I to World War II flamethrowers was dramatic. The early models were crude, unreliable, and even more dangerous to their operators. But American engineers, studying German designs and battlefield reports, created the M1 and later the M2-2 flamethrower systems that would become the standard. The weapon itself was deceptively simple: 2 tanks of thickened gasoline, a nitrogen propulsion system, and a nozzle that could project burning fuel up to 150 feet. But simple doesn't mean safe. Every flamethrower operator carried what was essentially a controlled explosion on their back, weighing nearly 70 pounds when fully loaded. The fuel wasn't ordinary gasoline either. Military chemists had developed a thickened mixture that would stick to surfaces and continue burning, creating an adhesive fire that couldn't simply be brushed off or extinguished with water. The Pacific Campaign presented American forces with a problem they'd never faced before. Japanese defenders weren't fighting conventional battles. They were digging deep, creating underground fortresses and turning entire islands into death traps. The Japanese had learned from earlier defeats at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. They realized that meeting American forces at the beach was suicide. American naval gunfire and air superiority would destroy surface defenses before the first Marine even set foot on land. So they went underground, on islands like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Peleliu. Japanese engineers carved elaborate tunnel systems through volcanic rock and coral. These weren't simple caves. They were underground cities with command centers, hospitals, ammunition dumps, and living quarters. Some tunnel systems stretched for miles, connecting defensive positions across entire islands. Take Tarawa, Saipan, or Peleliu. Each one taught the Americans that traditional weapons weren't enough. When an enemy could disappear into caves and tunnels, when they could survive direct naval bombardment by going underground, when pillboxes were built to withstand tank shells, that's when commanders turned to fire. Conventional explosives might collapse a tunnel entrance, but the defenders could simply dig out or use alternate routes, because fire doesn't care about concrete walls. Fire doesn't bounce off steel doors. Fire finds every crack, every crevice, every hiding place, and most importantly, fire consumes the one thing humans can't live without: oxygen. But understanding why flamethrowers were used doesn't explain why so many of their operators died. To understand that, we need to look at what it actually meant to carry one of these weapons into battle. The selection process for flamethrower operators was voluntary, but it often came down to desperation. Units needed these specialists, and someone had to step forward. First, there was the weight. 70 pounds of fuel and equipment strapped to your back while trying to move across a battlefield. You couldn't run fast, you couldn't take cover easily, and you certainly couldn't hide. The distinctive 3-tank silhouette made you instantly recognizable to every enemy soldier within sight. The weight wasn't just uncomfortable, it was tactically dangerous. Second, there was the range. Despite what movies might show you, Flamethrowers weren't long-range weapons. You needed to get within 50 yards, often much closer, to be effective. That meant crossing open ground, under enemy fire, carrying a giant target on your back. The effective range varied with wind conditions, fuel pressure, and the type of target. Third, there was the fuel capacity. A fully loaded flamethrower gave you about 10 seconds of continuous fire. That's it. 10 seconds to clear an entire bunker, cave, or defensive position. And once you fired, every enemy in the area knew exactly where you were. Most operators learn to fire in short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds at a time, to conserve fuel and maintain the element of surprise as long as possible. Enemy forces quickly learned to fear and prioritize flamethrower operators above all other targets. Japanese training manuals specifically instructed soldiers to eliminate flame troops at any cost. They weren't just another soldier. They were demons who brought hell to the battlefield. Japanese soldiers developed specific tactics for dealing with flamethrower operators. Snipers were instructed to target them first. This meant that from the moment a flamethrower operator was spotted, they became the #1 target for every rifle, machine gun, and mortar in range. They drew fire like magnets, often saving their squad mates' lives by becoming the enemy's primary focus. But it went beyond just being targeted. Capture meant something far worse than death for these soldiers. Enemy forces showed no mercy to flamethrower operators. They were seen as using an inhumane weapon, and they were treated accordingly. Many operators carried extra ammunition not for their flamethrowers, but for their sidearms, just in case capture seemed inevitable. There are documented cases from multiple Pacific battles where flamethrower operators who were captured alive were tortured for days before being killed. The weapons themselves were as dangerous to their operators as they were to the enemy. The fuel mixture, napalm or thickened gasoline, was highly flammable and under pressure. A single bullet puncturing the wrong tank could turn the operator into a human torch. Contrary to popular belief, the tanks wouldn't explode like bombs, but a rupture could spray burning fuel across the operator and anyone nearby. The ignition system was also vulnerable. A malfunction could cause the fuel to ignite at the nozzle, creating a blowtorch effect that could seriously burn the operator. Malfunctions were common and deadly. Nozzles could clog, ignition systems could fail, and fuel lines could rupture. When your weapon misfires at close range to an enemy position, you don't get a second chance to figure out what went wrong. Wind was another constant threat. A sudden gust could blow burning fuel back onto the operator or their squad. Desert sand could jam mechanisms. Tropical humidity could affect ignition systems. Every environmental factor seemed designed to turn the weapon against its user. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of being a flamethrower operator wasn't the physical danger, it was the psychological burden. Unlike other weapons that kill from a distance, flamethrowers forced soldiers into intimate, brutal combat. You could see everything. You could hear everything. The smell, the sounds, the aftermath. It all stayed with you. Many operators reported that they couldn't eat for days after using their weapon. Others developed severe trauma that lasted the rest of their lives. The psychological impact went beyond just witnessing death. Flamethrower operators had to live with the knowledge that they were causing some of the most horrific deaths imaginable. Fire doesn't kill quickly or cleanly. In enclosed spaces like bunkers and caves, the flames would consume all available oxygen, causing victims to suffocate even if they weren't directly burned. The temperature inside a cave hit by a flamethrower could reach over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal and glass. Post-war interviews with surviving flamethrower operators reveal a consistent pattern of guilt, nightmares, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Many refused to talk about their wartime service, even with their closest family members. Some developed severe alcoholism or depression. The weapon that was supposed to save American lives by quickly ending battles instead created lifelong trauma for the men who wielded it. The statistics are staggering. In major Pacific battles like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Saipan, casualty rates among flamethrower operators regularly exceeded 90%. In some units, entire flame squads were wiped out in single engagements. At Iwo Jima alone, out of 380 flamethrower operators deployed, only 18 survived the battle. That's not 18 uninjured, that's 18 who lived through it at all. Behind every statistic was a human story. Men like Herschel Woody Williams, who earned the Medal of Honor for his actions with a flamethrower on Iwo Jima, later struggled with the memories of what they had done. Williams lived until 2022, but he never forgot the faces of the men who died covering his advance, and he never fully made peace with the weapon that made him a hero. Many operators never talked about their service, even to their families. The shame and trauma weren't about cowardice. They had proven their courage beyond question. It was about being forced to use a weapon that felt fundamentally inhumane, even in the context of war. Veterans organizations reported disproportionately high rates of alcoholism, depression, and suicide among former flamethrower operators. By the 1970s, most militaries had quietly retired flamethrowers from active service. Officially, they were outdated by more modern weapons. Unofficially, they had become too controversial, too brutal, and too destructive to the soldiers who used them. The story of flamethrower operators in World War II isn't just about a weapon. It's about the men who were asked to carry hell on their backs and walk into death itself. They weren't monsters or madmen. They were ordinary soldiers given an extraordinary burden. 9 out of 10 never came home, but their sacrifice helped end one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The victory came at a price that we're still calculating decades later. The flamethrower may be gone from modern battlefields, but its legacy remains. Some weapons wound more than just the enemy, and some victories cost more than we ever intended to pay. The men who carried fire into battle paid that price with their lives, their sanity, and their souls. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that in war, the weapons we create to end suffering sometimes create the most suffering of all, especially for those brave enough to wield them. If you found this story as haunting as I did, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from history's darkest chapters. And remember, behind every statistic is a human story that deserves to be told.